Coding often feels overwhelming at first because it asks you to do several new things at once. You are trying to read carefully, notice patterns, make decisions, stay connected to your research question, and find language for what you are seeing. Even when you understand the idea of coding in theory, doing it in practice can still feel much harder than expected. That difficulty does not usually mean you are doing it badly. More often, it means the work is more complex than people admit when they first describe it. Coding is often introduced as if it were just labeling text. In practice, it is analytic decision-making. That is why the experience can feel heavy so quickly. At its core, coding is a way of organizing meaning in the data. You are noticing something happening in a segment and giving it a label you can return to later. That sounds simple when stated that way. What makes it hard is that meaning is rarely neat, singular, or obvious on the first pass. For example, imagine a participant says, "I keep rereading the email because I don't trust my tone." You understand the sentence. But coding asks you to go one step further. What is happening here that may matter analytically? Is this tone checking? Fear of misinterpretation? Self-editing for social safety? That is one of the first sources of overwhelm. Reading and coding are not the same task. Reading helps you understand what was said. Coding asks you to decide what is happening in a way you can use again later across many excerpts. That is a different level of thinking. Beginners often assume the hard part of coding will be technical. They expect the challenge to come from software, highlighting, or keeping track of files. Usually the harder part is mental. Your mind is trying to absorb the data while also sorting, naming, comparing, and questioning what belongs where. That cognitive load is real. A beginner may look at one short excerpt and feel as though there are too many possible directions at once. Am I coding the topic? The action? The feeling? The worry? The strategy? When those possibilities all appear at the same time, the work can feel crowded very quickly. This is especially true because qualitative data often carries multiple layers of meaning at once. A participant may describe what they did, how they felt, why they think it happened, and what they feared would happen next, all in one small piece of text. That density is part of what makes the data rich. It is also part of what makes coding hard at first. Another reason coding feels overwhelming is that many people think they are supposed to know immediately what the best code is. They assume good coders see one excerpt and instantly know exactly how to label it. In reality, early coding often involves choosing a workable label, not a perfect one. That distinction matters. If you think your task is to get every code exactly right the first time, coding will feel tense and high stakes. If you understand that early coding often means making a careful first decision that can be revised later, the work becomes much more manageable. This is where beginners often place too much pressure on themselves. They are not only trying to code the excerpt, they are also silently trying to prove that they understand the data, that they can think analytically, and that they are capable of doing qualitative research well. That extra pressure makes each small decision feel larger than it actually is. Coding also feels overwhelming because beginners often try to do too much too early. They want to know not only what the segment means, but whether it will matter later, whether it belongs in a future theme, whether it supports an argument, and whether it is central to the study. Those are later questions. Early coding becomes easier when it is allowed to stay early coding. At this stage, your task is usually smaller than you think. You are not yet trying to finalize themes. You are not yet trying to write findings. You are not yet trying to build the strongest possible interpretation of the whole dataset. You are trying to notice meaning in manageable pieces and give that meaning a usable label. That smaller task often gets lost because qualitative coding is described in ways that sound larger, looser, and more mysterious than it actually is. People hear phrases like, "let the themes emerge," or "just trust the process," and that language can make coding feel almost magical. Then, when the process feels messy instead of intuitive, beginners assume something is wrong. But qualitative coding is not magic. It is not passive discovery. You are not waiting for the transcript to reveal its secrets. You are doing active analytic work. You are comparing excerpts, trying labels, reconsidering them, noticing tensions, documenting questions, and gradually building a more stable sense of what is happening in the data. Once that is understood, the experience becomes easier to interpret. If coding feels uncertain, that does not mean you are failing to see what is obvious. It often means you are in the middle of real analytic work. Meaning is becoming clearer through your engagement with the data, not appearing automatically without effort. Coding can also feel overwhelming because beginners often mix levels of analysis without realizing it. One code may name a topic. Another may name an action. Another may name an emotion. Another may sound more like a theme than a code. When those different levels are all mixed together, the code list begins to feel unstable. For example, if one label is email, another is tone checking, another is fear of being judged, and another is managing communication risk, those are not all doing the same analytic job. Some are broad and descriptive. Some are closer to action. Some are more interpretive. Without realizing it, the beginner starts building a list that feels inconsistent because the labels are operating at different levels. That is why coding can feel confusing even when you are working hard and paying close attention. The problem is not always that you miss the meaning. Sometimes the problem is that you have not yet decided what kind of meaning you are trying to label. Once that becomes clearer, the work usually begins to settle. Another major source of overwhelm is the fear that everything important must be coded. Qualitative data is often vivid, emotional, and highly detailed. Beginners naturally worry that if they do not code a powerful moment, they are losing something valuable. That concern is understandable, but it can make coding feel endless. The difficulty is that not all interesting data is analytically relevant data. Something can be moving, memorable, or beautifully expressed and still fall outside the focus of the study. Learning to separate interesting from relevant is one of the most important shifts a qualitative researcher makes. This is where the research question becomes essential. Your research question is not just a formal requirement for a proposal or methods section. It is an analytic anchor. It helps you decide what your coding is actually for. Without that anchor, everything begins to compete for attention at the same level. When everything feels equally important, coding becomes exhausting. A transcript starts to feel crowded with possible meanings, and the researcher begins making decisions from anxiety rather than purpose. That kind of coding often produces many labels, but not much clarity. With a clear anchor, the decision-making changes. Instead of asking, "Could this matter in some way?" you ask, "Does this help answer what I am studying?" That question does not remove all uncertainty, but it reduces unnecessary uncertainty. It narrows the field. Coding also becomes overwhelming when beginners feel they must explain too much too soon. A participant describes difficulty starting a task, and the coder immediately wants to explain the cause. A participant describes reworking an email, and the coder jumps to a large interpretation about identity, anxiety, or social experience. That leap can make coding feel heavier than it needs to be at the beginning. Early coding is often stronger when it stays closer to what the participant actually said or did. What was happening here? What concern appeared in this moment? What was the participant trying to manage? What action did they take? Those questions tend to be more helpful at first than trying to produce the deepest explanation immediately. This does not mean interpretation is unimportant. It means interpretation has to be sequenced. If you push for explanation too early, you often create confusion because the data has not yet been organized enough to support that level of claim. Coding becomes easier when you allow yourself to notice before you explain. Another source of overwhelm is the mistaken belief that coding should feel linear. Beginners often think the process should look like this. Read the excerpt, assign the code, move on, and keep building steadily from there. In real qualitative analysis, coding is rarely that smooth. Labels are revised. Boundaries shift. Earlier decisions are revisited. That can feel discouraging if you expected your first codebook to be stable and polished. But revision is not a sign that the process is failing. Revision is often a sign that you are seeing the data more clearly. As your understanding deepens, your labels become more precise, more consistent, and more useful. Some beginners also become overwhelmed because they assume every segment must fit in one clear place. But qualitative data does not always behave that way. Sometimes an excerpt legitimately speaks to more than one issue. Sometimes the best initial decision is not to force a clean answer, but to acknowledge that the segment is doing more than one thing. That is why organizing structures can help. Parent codes, buckets, or broad containers give you a place to hold data before you fully know what the final analysis will look like. They do not eliminate the need for judgment, but they lower the pressure to solve everything immediately. This kind of structure is especially helpful for beginners because it changes the question. Instead of asking, "What does this mean in the biggest possible sense?" you begin by asking, "Where does this most reasonably belong right now?" That smaller question is often enough to keep the analysis moving. Memoing helps for a similar reason. A memo is a short analytic note you write to yourself when something feels important, unclear, or worth returning to later. It is not a final conclusion. It is a way of capturing your thinking while it is still taking shape. Sometimes a segment stands out, but you are not yet sure how to code it or what to do with it. Instead of forcing that uncertainty into a shaky label, you can write a memo. You might note what seems important, what question the excerpt raises, what tension you are noticing, or what you want to watch for in other interviews. That matters because beginners often experience uncertainty as a problem that must be solved immediately. Memos teach a different habit. Some uncertainties are not obstacles. They are observations that need to be documented and returned to after more data has been coded. Coding also feels overwhelming because beginners often confuse frequency with importance. They think the code that appears most often must be the one that matters most. But qualitative analysis is not just about counting repetition. A pattern may appear many times and still function mostly as background. Another may appear less often but reveal something crucial about tension, meaning, or consequence. When that distinction is not yet clear, beginners may start coding more and more in search of security. They hope that enough labels, enough repetition, or enough coded segments will finally make the analysis feel certain. Usually that creates more fatigue than insight. Volume does not automatically produce clarity. It is also important to name the emotional dimension of the experience. Coding can feel exposing because it reveals how much uncertainty you can tolerate, how quickly you want to reach conclusions, and how uncomfortable it can feel not to know exactly what something means yet. Some of the overwhelm comes from the complexity of the data. Some of it comes from the emotional demands of analytic patience. That is why early coding overwhelm should not automatically be read as incompetence. Often it is a sign that you are encountering the real shape of the work for the first time. You are moving beyond the idea that coding is just highlighting and labeling. You are beginning to see that it involves judgment, boundaries, comparison, and restraint. In that sense, some overwhelm is developmental. It appears when the work becomes more real. The beginner starts to notice that coding is not simply about grabbing a topic off the page. It is about deciding what kind of meaning is present, what to do with it, and how to keep those decisions aligned with the study. That developmental difficulty is different from being completely lost. A lost beginner often feels only panic. A developing beginner may still feel uncertain, but the uncertainty becomes more specific. Instead of "I have no idea what I am doing," it becomes, "I am not sure whether this should be coded broadly or narrowly," or "I am not sure whether this belongs in a code or a memo." Those are much more productive questions. Over time, coding becomes less overwhelming not because the data becomes simple, but because your decisions become more ordered. You begin to recognize common moves. You learn how to stay closer to participant language. You learn when to code, when to memo, when to park something, and when to leave it alone. You also begin to understand that confidence in qualitative coding does not mean immediate certainty. It means being able to explain your choices. Why did I use this label? Why did I keep this broad for now? Why did I not force this excerpt into a stronger interpretation? Why did I move this idea into a memo instead of a code? That is what confidence starts to look like. So if coding feels overwhelming, the most useful response is not self-critique. The more useful response is to simplify the task in front of you. You do not need to solve the full analysis in one sitting. You do not need to know the final themes yet. You do not need every label to be perfect. At first, the work is smaller than that. Read the excerpt. Ask what is happening. Ask whether it connects to your research question. Give it a usable label, or place it in a reasonable container. Write a memo if something feels important, but unresolved. Then move on. That sequence matters because beginners do not need less rigor. They need more visible scaffolding. They need to see that coding is not a mysterious leap from transcript to theme. It is a chain of small, defensible decisions made over time. That is why coding feels overwhelming at first. It asks you to build judgment before that judgment feels natural. It asks you to tolerate ambiguity before ambiguity feels manageable. It asks you to organize meaning before you yet trust your own analytic habits. None of that means you are doing it wrong. It means you are at the beginning of learning how qualitative analysis actually works. The goal is not for coding to feel effortless immediately. The goal is for it to become clearer, steadier, and more structured each time you do it. When that happens, the overwhelm usually changes shape. It becomes less like panic and more like thinking. You are no longer only asking, "Why does this feel so hard?" You begin asking better questions. What is happening here? What kind of meaning am I noticing? What does my research question allow me to do with this? Those questions do not remove the complexity of qualitative work. They help you work inside it. And that is often the first real sign of growth. The data is still rich. The process is still careful. But you are no longer trying to solve everything at once.
Coding also feels overwhelming. Beginners often become learning how qualitative matter not about what code that improves, but whether it's not your judgment matters more discipline. But quality learned how to work is not just about counting letters and structure. Those are later questions.
Early coding becomes easier when it is allowed to stay early but reveal something crucial about tension, meaning, or consequence.